All right, welcome to SenseSpace. It is my honor today to bring together a completely new group for this dialogue on Christianity. My friends, my fellows, philosophers, people who have and continue to wrestle with God in a meaningful sense. Ken Lowry, Joseph Pickens, and Daniel Gunner, Mr. O.G. Rose. It's great to have you all here today. We have set a fairly, and by we, I mean, I'm really referring to myself, have set quite open intention for this dialogue today. It's a very wide field, but it's a very alive field. And my hope is that it can be a dialogue guided from the heart and bringing together mind and spirit also. And with that, I just want to kick it off and invite you all to offer a brief introduction and perhaps speak a little bit to how you're relating to this big question, which is something like, am I Christian? Or are we Christian?
So I can start off. So my name's Ken. I just brief background in relation to this notion of Christianity. I grew up in a setting that was fairly fundamentalist Protestant Christianity. Transitioned somewhat to a more evangelical kind of Christianity. I went to a university called the Bible Institute of Los Angeles, which is one of the kind of I would say, more preeminent evangelical schools. They have a theological graduate program that has some folks such as William Lane Craig, who is a name people might know from Christian apologetics. So that was kind of my undergrad, and then over the past several years, kind of been on a journey outside of that, but also kind of continually returning to Christianity. I will often say that no matter where I go, I turn around and Christ is there behind me, or underneath me, maybe is a better way to say it. So I've started a YouTube channel. My thinking and my language is deeply informed by the work of John Vervaeke. And then, so I like the notion of wrestling with God. I think that's a good way to talk about how I see this journey. So thanks for having me, Jacob, and I'm excited to chat with you all about this.
Thank you, Ken.
Well, I can go next. So yeah, I'm Joe, and I grew up in a large conservative conservative Christian homeschool family. I'm one of 7 children, and I would say I had a bit of a unique experience in relationship to church, but generally we were, I suppose you could consider us like an evangelical family, Protestant. But I say have a unique relationship with church because when I was about 6 or 7, we stopped going to church altogether. My parents, they ran into some of the, I guess, more political side of church, and some issues there. And so that it really, that they've been, for basically as long as I can remember, they've been on this process of like trying to re-envision what church is supposed to be. And so a big part of that was like taking a step back from what they called like the institutional church. So that, obviously affected my upbringing. And then when I was about a teenager, I started going to, it's like the big church in Santa Cruz where I grew up. It's like, I wouldn't say it's a mega church, but it's like the biggest church there. And it has more of that, like, kind of like appealing to the masses sort of feeling to it. But like a really great community. Like I still like, I feel very much like I belong to that community still. Like it was such a big part of my formative years. And I've been really involved throughout my life in the performing arts world, and specifically the Christian performing arts world, where I grew up. And that continues to be like very close to, like near and dear to my heart. As an adult, so yeah, when I started like having these theological questions as a teenager, and kind of inherited my dad's like wrestling with these questions about like hell, and the nature of God is like a judge versus God is sort of more of a physician, maybe, like the God, like just the love of God and how that impacts one's view of hell and the afterlife and all of that. And then by the time I think I was 20 years old, and everything sort of just like, it all culminated in like a period of about a week. And I reached this point where I was like, the whole narrative just feels so arbitrary to me. And so it just sort of collapsed for me. Like my whole worldview, my whole upbringing just fell apart. And since then I went through like this brief, like new atheist path, and then stumbled across Jordan Peterson, and from him into like John Vervaeke and Jonathan Pageau. And I would also say like Vervaeke's had probably the biggest influence on me. Like certainly right now, that's where like I just sort of find myself thinking in terms of like a lot of his vocabulary. And then so I've been exploring more of like the Orthodox Church these days, and trying to find kind of where I belong. And so that's kind of, yeah, it's as I get older, it becomes a much more like existential question for me, this question of, am I a Christian? Not just like, you know, I don't know, as a teenager, it's like, oh, what do I want to label myself? And there's not as much existential weight to it. But now I'm finding it's like, this is important. It informs like, where am I going to be, you know, physically spending my time? Who am I going to be talking to? Where, you know, in the future, how am I going to be raising my kids? How, like, what does community look like for me? So, yeah, that's kind of where I'm at in relationship to this question.
Well, goodness, those were all outstanding. Jacob, Ken, Joe, it's a thrill to have a chance to speak with all of you, and thank you for sharing your stories. We don't know why we're here if we don't know what we've gone through, so that's really, really wonderful. So my pen name is OG Rose. It means Opperman Garner Rose. My wife and I have written together since about 2011, although I've been scribbling to say things since I was an 8-year-old, but I also go by Daniel. So Daniel Garner. We live in Central Virginia on a farm. We have 3 children, run a wedding venue. I worked at a wholesale for a long time, and run around and convince the children not to get lost in the forest, which requires quite a lot of negotiation. I would say I came certainly from a conservative background. You know, you mentioned this kind of movement between fundamentalism, I live in Lynchburg, Virginia. Liberty University is right over there. Quite a big conservative place that we have over there. So move between different kind of movements like that. I would say that kind of later in life, when I got to UVA, I was like, wait a minute, who's this guy called Augustine? Who's Aquinas? Who are all these people? And really sort of found out this entire world of theological thought that I was not aware of, and all these different alternatives and different things. And also, I would say I kind of went through a phase where there was a lot of people who kind of just almost said, oh, it's like Christianity is silly, and almost just kind of out of hand said it was silly without necessarily going through it. And I could see where they were coming from as well. But I was like, well, but let me see what all this stuff is, and went through and through. And also then what was interesting, I would say that was a period where I also kind of experience the magic of returning to primary texts, because it turns out what a lot of people tell you books say is not what books say. And then you go through that process and you're like, well, there's a lot going on. And then, I went through a phase where I helped, I ran an art gallery and venue and performance place. So Joe, I'm all about that for a long time. It wasn't necessarily a Christian organization, but it was called eunoia, which in the Greek means beautiful thinking. It can be translated as beautiful thinking. And we also did have a ministry that met there that I helped run and operate that was interested in the question, what does the gospel compel you to do as an artist? Because we were very concerned where it seemed like the artist was particularly unable to figure out how they could fit into Christianity. They were very confused. Now, this is back in, 2008 through 2011. Fortunately, there's been a lot more work of people considering the question of beauty and art and different things. You mentioned Mr. Pajot. We know Mr. Pajot does quite a bit in that. Vervaeke will also talk about hermeneutics of beauty and so on and so forth. But back then, boy, howdy, was it rough, because people were very confused of it. And also, you would have such a push in, say, it was very difficult in, say, more fundamental conservative structures of Christianity to figure out where art would fit into it. And I mean, it's hard to figure out where it fits into culture, let alone talking about sort of a more conservative branch of Christianity. So then figuring out. Now, I don't mean to say that all conservative Christians have nothing to do with art, but I was just not grown up or knew of a kind of tradition or where those things would fit into. So did a lot of work at that. This is the part where I can start talking about theologians I resonate with. I love Hans Balthasar. I think the new perspective, like N.T. Wright, is quite lovely. I did a little bit of, I read all of Karl Barth, which was silly because there's way too much of that. And then some more on the Balthasar side of different things. And then also I was really, really big on, and still very big on, like the literature, like Flannery O'Connor, Walker Percy, Dostoevsky, I can list off things, T.S. Eliot, and so on and so forth. So that would be where I would say my Christianity is very interested in that question. I would say it's also, I have a very strong emphasis on like the Trinity, on Trinitarian thinking in Christianity, which I think is very, very important. So I would say I share a similar story to these fine gentlemen in different interests and different things, and thinking that way. And I think also that certainly Mr. Vervaeke, Dr. Vervaeke and Pajot and different people are interested in those fields as well. So that would, I would say, my story. So gentlemen, thank you for sharing, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Thanks so much. Amazing to hear about this ministry for artists. It sounds like the recipe that I could use some of whatever knowledge was stirred up there. Yeah. Gosh, I guess for myself, a lot of interesting commonalities with Joseph. I grew up in a church, albeit more kind of hippie evangelical Christianity in the UK, which my parents were involved in, starting with youth work. And then my father was a pastor in that. And then around 8, 9, 10, something around that, they left that church. My father remained in relationship to what he calls the Jesus person, somebody who was named over my bed every night before I went to sleep. And a few years ago wrote a book called Church: A Counter-Narrative, which was what he decided to call his biography. So he's very much part of that deconstructionist sort of community. It's not a particularly academic book. It's much more a practitioner kind of experiential thing. But in the course of my journey, I indeed ended up atheistic and rationalistic. And then I had this strange draw to Islam, the religion of submission, and exploring that for several years. I found the spirit in psychedelics first. I found it then in nature, and finally in dialogos. And in these three things, I found insight, wisdom, and healing, which is what SenseSpace is. What I've kind of distilled is, what are these dialogues about? Insight, wisdom, and healing. So fast forwarding to today, I have this really strange sense that I've somehow been building this architecture without knowing that I'm building it, in which at the very late stage, all of this Christian stuff is like slotting into. The sense of being on a path, the sense of not knowing where it's going, of being in a relationship or a dialogue with life that's going somewhere. yeah, a lot of that stuff is very Christian. I'm realizing in hindsight. And so in the course of my own personal vicissitudes and tragedies, quite recently, I found prayer to be deeply, deeply, deeply essential. I don't know where I would be without that. And Dialogos has been great. Communing in nature has been great. But for whatever reason, prayer in churches has been the thing that has carried me through the wilderness, through the desert, through the storm, whatever you want to call it. And so that is a journey that I consider myself to be on. And in the course of recent weeks and months, I have been astonished to find that the Jesus person, it seems to be coming through the ground of my psyche, almost like a face coming up through the ground of my psyche. And I feel like I'm getting glimpses of that face, and it's emotionally overwhelming and much more personal than the relationship that I've had with God as the whole, in a much less personal sense. And that's been healing too, but this is a whole different thing. And it feels like all of this reflection on the cross that I've been undergoing over the last 6 months, and feeling like I'm getting closer and closer, getting intimacy with the cross. Cross is coming closer to me, coming into me. Only in the late stages of that is the Jesus person popping in, and now it's confounding my rational sensibilities and models. And I'd been exploring Teilhard de Chardin and Christ consciousness up to this point, but that's quite different. Having this figure emerge in your third eye and come and be company with you when you're in solitude, and put a hand on your back. And so that's where I'm at, and that's just a fucking trip.
Would you be willing to share a little bit more? I mean, it sounds like these are, I'm just curious about the nature of the experience that you're having. I mean, you said hand on your back. Like, are you having a sense of like more than just, say, kind of a mystical, like visionary type experience? There's more elements to it than that, it sounds like.
Well, I wouldn't describe it as similar to having an actual hand on my back or some a material person in the room. As I said, it's in the third eye. It feels like that place, but that kind of technicolor place when you close your eyes and you're on a mushroom trip or something, and images are emerging and forming. It's in that same mechanism through which this image is coming up to meet me. But while in the initial context, it didn't feel like I was conjuring it up. It just seems like the compounding of all of the prayer up to that point, and the depth of the tragedy that I found myself bound up in, seems to have conjured this forth. So yeah, that's the juncture I find myself at. And so obviously Christianity is getting a lot more real for me in recent days and weeks, which I'm very immensely grateful for, and seems to be the only way to navigate my own journey. And there's such a like, wow, that energy that causes people to be like, yeah, I'm Christian, but then there's something that's holding it back. And there's like a last 5% that you have to cross to get to using that word. And I'm just not comfortable. It doesn't feel like it's for me or for this moment in history to just adopt that word and that identifier, and I see the possibility of a kind of Christ culture emerging during this time that is somehow different from that, or is rooted in that, but is connected with these other things that aren't really Christian, and is with the nature mysticism, with the psychedelic culture, with all of this other stuff that's going on.
So Jacob, what is it that holds you back from going that extra 5%, or however you said it?
I think it's probably a rejection, and there was like such a paramount feeling of cringe towards the Christianity of my upbringing, that particularly like contemporary Christian rock Christianity. I mean, I would feel comfortable saying I'm a cultural Christian because it seems to just be a statement of fact and reality. But Christian as like how I introduce myself to people. If I meet someone and they're a Hindu and they ask, what's my religion? I don't feel like responding, I'm a Christian. That feels like it's putting me in a box that is really not in relationship to how I've got to where I am, or necessarily the thing that leads to the opening of a dialogue that's actually going to be generative and interesting.
Yeah. Sorry, did you want to go ahead, Joe?
Go ahead, Ken.
Well, I resonate with this a lot, because for me, I've been wrestling with this idea for a while, and this is kind of why I had that conversation with Paul just a few days ago, Paul Vanderklay, talking about this. And I think, like, I don't know, more and more it becomes a semantic issue for me, because it's not as if there's anything about what it means to actually follow Christ, or what it means to actually participate with Christ, or what it means to participate with the depths of the tradition, that cause, at least for me in my experience, those don't seem to evoke that kind of hesitancy for me. When I read, one of the deepest Christian thinkers for me that I've encountered is St. Maximus the Confessor. And when I read St. Maximus, I have no difficulty following him and or affirming that sense of what it means to participate in reality. And but at the same time, right, there's this whole problem, which is, say, the cultural milieu of what Christianity has come to mean. And so I know for myself, there's this identity problem, right? It's like, as soon as I take on the identity takes on me in a way, right? I have to carry it or something, and then I have to defend it, and I have to pull at it, and I have to wrestle with it, which is fine, but it causes this issue where I don't want to identify myself as a Christian to people, because the kind of thing that, say in the average person that I meet when I'm at work, the kind of thing they hear is not the kind of thing I mean. And so in that sense, it's a real semantic issue, because we just have we have so much difficulty with the term. So that's, I try to, one of the things that's coming through for me as I continue through this journey of struggling with this exact issue is, there's one thing that it means to actually want to participate with Christ, and to participate with Christ, and to be a follower of the way. And that's 100%. I can affirm that. And I'm in a place personally where I feel I can affirm, pretty much everything that would be in the creeds and those kinds of things. Now, what those words may mean to me might be slightly different, but I don't, that, again, semantics. But then, but that's there's this whole other thing where there's this, what's been actualized in church, which is like, the existential is always far below the aspirational, right? Like what's been manifested in the church especially over the past couple of 100 years. And I mean, you can point it at any point in history where there's just disasters, like the complete inverse of Christ likeness that shows up through the church. That creates a lens that is so distorted that it creates a problem.
No, I think that tension that you're describing, Jacob, is extremely warranted, and I appreciate the answers that were given. One of the great tensions in life, I think, is trying to tell the difference between fear and wisdom. It's not always easy. The Bible's quite obsessed with saying, "Be not afraid." The one who fears is not made perfect in love, because fear has to do with torment. Arguably, Jesus's number one command is not to be afraid. He says it all the time. Unfortunately, it's not always clear what's the difference between fear and wisdom. If I look out my window and there's a lion there, well, it's quite clear that going outside would not be a matter of courage. It would be a matter of stupidity, right? But if I look at my window and there is no lion there, and I have no reason to think there's a lion there, and I'm afraid that there's a lion there, that would be fear. And that would be what Jesus is calling you not to do. Now, not all situations are so clear cut, and they fall within this gray zone where you have to discern. And there is indeed a wisdom in the awareness that when you tell someone, "I am Christian," that can mean a million things to a million people and actually shut down dialogue. It is not necessarily a matter of fear at all. It can be a matter of shame and fear in Jesus and different things like that, of which at that point, the motivation would be wrong. But if it's in fact from a motivation of a place where you say, I don't know what the word Christian means to this person, and I myself am not sure what I say that necessarily entails, right? One of the things that I always find when I guess when I was in a situation where I was like, they've asked me that question, but I'm not sure how they'll receive it, is something I would sometimes do is say, if I were to tell you Christian, what would that mean to you? Like, to turn it as a question on them to where they can tell me what they think Christianity is, and then I can reply to that. And also too, like, talking about Christianity, I've also found over the years, it's important to basically only do that in a circumstance where there's a dialogue. Like, if it's a quick trivia question, like, where are you from, what's your name, what's your religion, and so forth, and we're just doing trivia questions or whatever, that doesn't tend to be quite constructive, because then we're just, it doesn't lead to anything. But that structure of, I just always found when you say, if I were to answer Christian, what does that mean to you, is very, very important, because, when one Christian, I mentioned New Perspective of Paul. If I say Christian, that could mean penal substitution atonement, and a lot of other terms that if I mention, no one will watch this video. And so these different things that are quite confusing and difficult, right? Now, I'm not saying you necessarily have to get into all of that. I'm just saying that those are things in the culture that people know. Also, people associate, say, Christianity with certain political views. And if you say, I am Christian, they say, oh, you believe X, Y, and Z. And you may not, or you may not believe in those views in the same way, right? Like, if I mention the word heaven to you, well, there's a giant debate on what heaven means in Christianity, right? It doesn't necessarily mean a realm that you run off to for NT, right? Heaven is the presence of God, and it comes to be on earth, and there's new creation and resurrection and incarnation are really emphasized, not sort of a dualistic sort of way of things, right? Well, when you say Christian, they may think you believe in that dualistic conception of things, right? Now, of course, even a term like dualistic, you have to get into. And we stopped at the trivia question of Christianity, right? So I think there's a wisdom, I guess I would say, in an awareness of that hesitancy of that 5%. And then the question is examining the nature of that hesitancy to determine if it's a matter of wisdom or if it's a matter of fear. And if it's a matter of wisdom, it can be like, well, I want to examine what exactly it means to me, to determine what it is. So then if I would even turn it and ask the person, when I say Christian, what does that mean to you? You can then say, well, no, actually, and then have a response. So I think there's a wisdom in that awareness of that hesitancy. And I think it's important to identify that there can be a wisdom in it. That is, because sometimes, and dare I say, from Christian cultures that are maybe more conservative, hesitancy equals fear, bad, sin, you're, really, really bad, right? It's necessarily a bad thing. But I don't believe that's the case at all. And I actually think there can be a wisdom in it. So, and then in just exploring that space.
It's also a beautiful way to change it, right? Because there's a fundamental difference between categorizing someone based on an identity that they claim and opening up space to explore something that it's actually worth exploring.
Oh, completely. And especially when you live in a culture where answers are like propositional knowledge. And basically, if you say Christian, you're talking a story. So there's a very low probability that if you were to answer a question, that they would understand you're talking about a story with the average person. They're going to hear a list of propositional beliefs. So right there, you've got a problem that will require, I think it requires a mechanism of kind of turning it to invite into telling the story. So I find that as an important move.
Yeah, just to briefly respond to that, really thankful for that delineation of fear and wisdom, Daniel. And the first thing that it evoked for me was like the fear of like of the apostles denying Jesus, kind of that fear. That I definitely don't want that. I don't want or particularly feel guilty of that. I think what I find. Okay, so there's one thing, maybe we can pin this for a little further along, is the necessary wedding of faith and philosophy. That feels like something that's coming through in what you're saying. But just at a practical, immediate level, I think, well, it's taken a long road to get to where I am, and I'm sure it's going to go further than I'm yet comfortable with. And that's definitely part of it. And I've been reading Kazantzakis' book on Francis of Assisi, and that's a very provocative text as well. And when you read something like that and you're having the experiences I have, there is a little bit of tremor and fear, like, what if I gave myself over to this? Then what would that provoke me to do that I otherwise wouldn't do? Which is an interesting, nervous, edgy space to be in. And I definitely confess that. And the other experience I'm having is that I was happy to go along and sing Christmas carols and celebrate the holiday in a traditional Church of England fashion. I've been praying solitary in a Catholic church in Bournemouth every day, and some days I go in there and there's a service happening. And I don't feel part of that congregation. And when they do the Eucharist, I've held back every time because I'm at a point where I'm open to any of these mysteries being actually true, because what I thought was possible is being confounded. But insofar as I don't believe that is, like, it feels, I've taken the communion before without taking it seriously. And now it feels like I'm not taking it unless I really, really think that there's a miracle on the other side of that bread and wine, for one thing. And then it's like, it feels like there are emotions and parts of myself, what it means to throw down on one's knees, what it means to praise, which one needs to find the proper context that you're actually comfortable to be that or do that. And I just don't know about any of the ones that I've seen so far. And maybe there's a necessity in that. Maybe there's a waiting for something that's not yet there.
I think one of the things that I hear when you're saying that is something that I've sensed in myself, where I end up placing so much gravity on my participation or way of participation, or am I doing it correctly, or am I doing it for the correct reasons? And I don't know. There's a deep value in that, I know, because it is that sense that has spurred my journey in the first place, right? It was the fact that I was no longer willing to participate in something that was superficial that allowed me to become something much more than I was. And so I think it's a very important thing, but I think we can also go a little bit too far with it in the sense that we are too hesitant to engage things, like where maybe there's a way in which we can just try it and see, and work with it. And like, there's this middle path between my actions have so much depth and consequence, right? And then on the other hand, it's like, well, it's all not actually dependent on me because Christ already did the work. / I'm already here. If you don't like the Christian story, like I'm real. It's I'm not struck down depending on what I do. So I guess like just in hearing you say that, it's like I wanted to say, yeah, I totally get it, and I'm on board for that, and I'm there. But also, like, you can just try it too. You know, don't be afraid to just try it. I think I'm saying that to myself as much as you, because I'm like, I'm probably even more on the outskirts than you do. Like I don't really go to church, hardly at all.
I like that, Ken, because I relate to the feeling of this question having so much weight to it, that it becomes kind of crushing in a way. And then every little action that I take one way or the other is just this momentous thing, and it's just too much pressure. But at the same time, I'm really relating to this fear thing, specifically fear around how I'm going to be perceived by others if I sort of commit more fully to that identity as a Christian. Because that identity is not just what I say it is. Like what the word Christian, it's a thing we all negotiate on in terms of its meaning. And it, you know, there's a lot that you're up against when you're trying to negotiate that the meaning of the word Christian, because you're one person against, you know, this huge culture. At least that's what it feels like. And so the fear there is like, it's how can I sort of step into this, but not become confused in my own identity when I, you know, because you step into a social environment and you're aware of how everyone is perceiving you, and that affects how you're perceiving yourself. And so you get all tangled up in this. And the other thing I wanted to say is, like, coming from a more evangelical background, there is this sense of like, when the new guy steps into the room, it's like, oh, here's an opportunity. Like there is all of this, there's this intense pressure to, like, you know, convert people. And I don't experience that as much living like on the West Coast in like more liberal environments. There's less of that. There's more like, you know, you do you sort of thing. But there's still that background sense of like, I don't know, like the sense that like all eyes are on me as this person who's like not fully in, but like they want you to be fully in. And that's it's really it's difficult to feel like I truly belong in that space. And so it's just like, it's a very tense place to be. And that's, but that's what I'm hearing in Jacob's story as well, and probably in all of ours, that there is a great deal of tension in all of our experiences around this question.
I like something that you come up for me when you were saying that is like, I always like to question the assumptions underlying something like this question, right? Like what's the assumption that I need to have an identity is an assumption, right? Like I need to take a stance on this. And I suppose where I've been landing on this from my experience is that I don't need to. Now, depending on the relationship of the definition, I'm happy to claim it or not. But I think it's so easy to feel as if we need to be identified with a group in order to not feel outside. You know, like you're saying, and I need to be converted to this thing, or and there is something to be said about commitment to community, absolutely. But this notion that has been bound up with Christianity for some time, that depending on whether or not I claim this identity has some kind of ramification as to the eternal state of my being, I think is utter nonsense personally. And I can make all kinds of like philosophical and theological reasons for that. But I think maybe pulling that away from, I guess I'm wondering how that lands for you guys in terms of situating the question of, do we claim this identity or not?
There's another piece I'd really love to add to that, which is, as well as the sense of like, well, I've recently come to dialogue more with various Christians, and the part of the tension that I feel is there is a narrative worldview and a structure and a membrane that people have lived in. And when they hear you say that you're Christian, that is an invitation for them to then include you in the membrane that they already have. And it's an essential and important part of my journey that I have found meaning, relationship to spirit, healing, in contexts that were, as far as I'm concerned, completely outside of that narrative structure. And the implications of that are enormous. It just so happens that journeying in those terrains has somehow led me back. But there's something about the possibility of mystical unity here that seems important, and the possibility of being translators and people between enmeshed worldviews. And so giving over one thing I'm getting so far is, okay, I don't need to have a set rule. Daniel's always very good at this, context, giving contextual use of the word may be appropriate depending on the right moment. But broadly speaking, it's very important to me that Christians know that there is stuff outside of Christianity that's just as real. And I see myself at this intersection of people like me and Joseph, broadly speaking, who explored things like psychedelics and metamodernism and systems thinking and philosophy, but come from a Christian culture. And it's so important that those people go and discover the Christian piece because it's a part of themselves. But the Christians also, I feel, need to go on the journey in the other direction. And so kind of holding both of those, because Christianity is declined for various reasons, and God has died for various reasons, and our culture is traumatized and split in dualistic thinking at deep levels for various reasons that it's not clear to me the Christian culture that we've inherited is actually equipped to do. So what I'm looking at is potentially something that's not that, but it's that somehow Christ culture is emerging and weaving together that with things that are outside of that into something that's a bit of both.
So that was all marvelous. A few things. So I may end up actually costing you some views, because I might even bring up some of the justification by faith and all of those distinct and different things. Do forgive. Also, there is again a wisdom in saying, if I take this Eucharist, what does that mean exactly? Arguably, one of the great problems is people are like, yeah, you just take the Eucharist. Yeah, you just ask Jesus into your heart. Yeah, you just believe this stuff. Not really thinking of, you are literally claiming that God came in the form of a man, which is kind of crazy. If you really think about it, it's kind of nuts. He died on a cross, and somehow that heals the rupture in the cosmic order. Yeah, just believe it. We have great lunches every Wednesday at noon. You ought to come, and you can if you believe it. And you see, there's a little bit of a proportional mismatch in all of that, right? And likewise, if you say this Eucharist is the body of God, that That's the body of God. That is literally the presence of God. Yes. Okay. These are quite large claims, and it is not foolish to be aware of that. At the same time, one of the reasons, if I were to venture into this question, I think one of the things that has made this very, very difficult is that there is not in a lot of Christian thought. Now, I'm talking from a Protestant background. These distinctions are far better in, say, East Orthodox or Roman Catholicism, or the house down the street that is non-denominational, I don't know about. But they have this distinction between the question of justification by faith. Okay, so there's a lot of people that say justification by faith equals salvation. All right, faith alone is by which you are saved. Okay, and that would be where you get into things like penal substitutional atonement, substitutional atonement, and different things like that. But the question is if there's a difference between membership to Christianity and salvation. And this is where, say, the new perspective of Paul comes forth. And the reason I'm going through this is because I promise it's relevant to the question. I promise. You see, if indeed, when Paul is talking about justification by faith alone, what he's talking about is membership into the work of God on planet Earth, because before then, the only way you could be part of God's people is to have a Jewish mother, to be circumcised, and to follow the law. He is literally saying, hey, you can now be part of God's work on planet Earth simply by faith. You no longer have to follow the same covenantal membership requirements. This is a huge deal because before Jesus, the only way to be part of God's work on planet Earth was to be born Jewish. You had to have a Jewish mother. Now, later Judaism seems, and some people argue that there were forms of conversion in earlier Judaism, and therefore Paul, didn't need to do all this. And then after Maimonides, the guy who wrote Guide to the Perplexed, there's some notions of possible conversions. Regardless, it seems to be that Paul either thought you couldn't convert, you couldn't join the covenant membership without circumcision or having a Jewish mother, because that's what they'll ask you. They'll ask you, is your mother Jewish? Do you share the bloodline? Because Judaism comes through the mother bloodline. Well, that means if you were born a Gentile, you're out because you're born a Gentile, so you're out of the game, right? And Paul's saying you can't do or he's telling people you don't have to be circumcised, you don't have to keep the feast days or the special Sabbath days and different things like that. Well, this is indeed good news because he's saying now literally Romans can be part of God's work on planet Earth, because up to that point, it's only the Jewish people that can do it. So by justification, so you are justified to be in the work of what Christ is doing simply by faith. You are now members in that covenant work. The question of salvation, though, like who is saved and who is not, gets into questions of God's judgment. So these are kind of different questions. Now I can get into that. And also the notion of faith alone saves you. Now this is where I would be canceled by some different things. There actually is no such thing as faith that is not in a feedback loop with works. Like you tend to believe what you do, and what you do tends to create what you believe. Okay, so there is no such thing as like faith alone. Indeed, there can be justification by loan into the membership of Christ. But when we're talking about, do you really believe that Jesus was the Son of God? If you just have faith that he was the Son of God, that being defined as propositional knowledge. No, because action creates faith and faith creates action. And that whole debate between faith and works in terms of salvation has led to a whole lot of confusion, because then basically you're led to, if I don't have faith right now that Jesus was the Son of the God and clearly define my beliefs right now, I cannot be saved. Right? All of that kind of follows from a notion that salvation is in terms of what you believe. Well, now there's a real big imperative to get clarity of belief, definition of belief, and to say what your faith is. But actually, funny enough, if there's no such thing as faith that is not in a feedback loop with works, then it's actually impossible to have faith that pleases him unless you're diligently seeking him. Like that doesn't exist, actually. And so then having the imperative, like you're talking about, of this diligent desire to try to seek him and to know who he is actually precisely the kind of work that creates a certain sort of faith, right? Now, there are also categories like salvation, sanctification, membership, and all those things. And we can certainly go through all of those different things. But the point is, there's kind of two questions. There's like the question of membership. What do I need to do to say I am willing to be part of God's work on planet Earth? Well, for Paul, basically, it's to say that Jesus is the Son of God, or that he is God, or that he is somehow working in a manner that he is the deepest, Ken said this quite well, like in the talk the other day, the deepest, somehow it's an expression of the deepest possible story of reality that somehow touches most approximately on whatever deepest reality is. And it's very, very big. So a Christian would be someone who says, I believe that, okay, well, hey, congratulations. You're now a member in the Christian story, right? Now you have to then work through what are the implications of that, right? Like that's where now you have to keep thinking. It's like, well, what does that mean for, marriage, food, job, occupation, all the other minor beliefs? Well, then you have to keep diligently working through that and to figure it out, right? But the question, this is the point. A lot of people have in their head that they have to work all of that out before they can start Christianity, as opposed to work all of that out in Christianity. That is a very big difference. And it's, of course, here's the thing, it is in Christianity. That's why Paul's writing all of these letters, rather in Corinthians, Galatians, whatever, trying to work through these complicated problems. They're like, hey, Paul, that bread that's for the pagan gods, can we eat that? Or would that be saying we can't eat it? And Paul's like, okay, well, all right, well, let me take this through. All right, if you eat it in front of the pagans, that would say that you believe in their God. So no, you can't eat that bread on the altar in front of the pagans. But when they're not around, of course you can eat it, because those gods are not God and Jesus is Lord, or different things. So what are they doing? They're thinking through a particular issue to try to figure out what the Christian thing would be to do. They would not be doing that if all you need is a certain sort of faith and then you're done with the picture, right? There's all this working through. We have to work out nuclear, what is the Christian response to drones, right? You basically have to do similar things that Paul's doing. It's and you have to think it through and you say, well, we don't use drones, or maybe we use them under these circumstances because it saves civilian life. You have to do that work. So the point I would say is one should not conflate the continual need to work through the issues of Christianity and what it means to them with membership into Christianity, because the working through what is the implications of the faith of Christianity, arguably that working through is Christianity. That is the very wrestling of God that defines Israel. You see in Judaism, and also the reason I make this distinction between justification and salvation and all that is because it really brings Judaism and Christianity together much more, because they're much more interlinked together. And Judaism has a constant emphasis. This is why the rabbis have this tradition of perpetual conversation on the Torah and going through and the Talmud and all these different things. That tradition that's very much alive in Judaism, you do not see that end in Paul. You do not see that. You don't even see that in the life of Jesus. The Sadducees and Pharisees are coming up and be like, hey, what about this one? Hey, what about this one? Hey, what about this one? He's got an answer. He's going to reply, and they're going back and forth like a hip hop cipher, which we used to do at Eunoia. We would have loved to have had you, Jacob. Would have been great. Those are great. Jesus can use ciphers, no doubt. And so those go back and forth. So it's just very important. And then, so the working out is not something you need to do before you have membership. Okay. Membership is a question of believing that Jesus is the supreme story. For me, it would mean Jesus is God. Now we can talk about what that means and all the different things like that Jesus heals a rupture in a very important way in the very cosmos of reality, and that we are participating in that work, in that story. And then there's a working out of what that would mean and how it trickles through. And I think that work is very important, because then also being a Christian means Christ-likeness and working toward Christ-likeness, not just having beliefs where you're like, because when you have too much emphasis on justification by faith as a kind of salvation, I have the beliefs, I'm done, I'm going to go back to football now. I'm going to go watch some more games and have a few more potato chips. Now, if instead the working out of Christianity is Christianity, you're going to need some new hobbies. You're going to have to do some different things, because Christ-likeness is then the real emphasis, and working through that. And Jesus is struggling in Gethsemane. He's getting irritated with his disciples. He's not always having a good day. That working through things is indeed part of the Christ-likeness. And it's a very important thing. Then the last thing I'll say, and pass it on whoever wants to speak, the tension you're talking, that Joe was talking about and Kim was, and I think we've all felt, I've certainly felt it, where you have someone who doesn't know Jesus and they come in and you say, oh, we need to evangelize to them. Well, there's a difference between an evangelicism that is a certain sort of, I want to tell you about the possibility of membership, versus I want to save you from hell. Because basically we just said that salvation is a matter of working through things in a perpetual way. You cannot skip that step just by simply telling people about Jesus. Well, that changes the entire notion. And then second, there's a question of effectiveness. If I come up to you and say, Jacob, you should be a Christian, doesn't it feel like I'm selling you a product? Doesn't it feel like I'm telling you about the new Netflix deal you can get or something like that? Not really compelling, seeing as there's lots of people telling you to be Republican, Democrat, Islam, atheist, rationalist, whatever, right? You just go to the supermarket, pick the one you want, right? Not really a compelling vision. But what if, in fact, evangelism has a lot more to do with being beautiful and attracting people into a story. That's a very different kind of evangelicism, because what does it do? In an evangelicism that puts all the emphasis on telling you the right things you should believe, all the work is on you to do, and if you don't do it, you're wicked. But if evangelism is instead about being beautiful and attracting people to the story, the onus is on you. You have to do the work. You have to be more Christ-like. And also, too, I will say that matches the structure of the Bible, because in the Torah, God is making a people that are to be beautiful, that attracts in the nations that people see. When Paul says, go to the nations and spread the gospel, he's assuming you're still beautiful. Because when you show up in Rome and you say, by the way, everyone, the membership requirements changed, all you need to do is have faith. And then they see the person saying that who's beautiful, they're like, that's excellent, because I want to be like that. If you don't have the beauty and you tell people the membership requirement changed, they're not going to care. It's like there being a deal to join a gym that's 50% off, and the gym is terrible. Do you care that the membership is 50% cheaper? No, because the gym is terrible. You do not care. If you lower the membership requirement, there's an assumption in Paul that you will be beautiful to attract people into that story. So Christians should be in the business of evangelism through beauty, through being like Christ and attracting people into that story. And then from that place, tell people that all you have to do to be part of this is believe. That is a very different narrative. And it's a narrative I think can change the world.
Yeah, that was excellent. And your words are beautiful, but I feel where my attention is going is probably towards like the least beautiful part of what you just said, which is not like what I find beautiful about what you just said is the work. To be a Christian is to be in actively engaged in the process of working out what it actually means to be a Christian.
Sure.
That is beautiful to me. And that is what I'm trying to do, regardless of whether I, consider myself a member or not. But that is the question that I want to narrow in on, because the way you framed it was like, there is that belief involved in order to participate, to call yourself a member, to be a member. And that I want to get in on that, because that's like really the sticking point for me, is like to believe that Jesus is the Son of God, or rather, more specifically, the resurrection of the historical Jesus of Nazareth. Like, do I propositionally assent to that fact that happened at a certain point in history, that sort of my membership in the church hinges on that question? And that's where I feel like, first of all, is that true? Does my membership in the church hinge on that question? And if it does, then like, why? Like, what is that? Like, I don't know. There's something doesn't quite work for me in that. And I'm like, this is the thing I've been wrestling with for like 2 years now, is that question of like, why can't everything else about Christianity, it's like, it's come together for me in such a powerful way. And yet that fundamental question about the historical resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth is like, something breaks or something doesn't work when I try to make that happen. And so that's like, for me, the crucial question as far as like, can I be a member of the church? Excellent. So I would love to explore that, if like there's if anyone wants to explore that question.
I would like, oh goodness, hold on. Sorry, carry on.
That was epic. The light went out where I went to speak. It was excellent. I appreciate that response. I will also note that the language, there's a question of like, if you don't have, when we talk about member, there's a language of this because of body, and you're a member of the body. And it's like the body of Christ and the operations of the church. There's another term that can be used in some of boundary marker, like it marks the definition of the thing, which if you don't have any boundaries at all, well, there's no definition, and then it kind of flies off. But of course, this is the tension. What and this is why it's really important, and then I'll give it to Ken just as a note before continuing on with the question you asked, is that Paul makes very clear distinctions between parts of the law that are boundary markers and parts of the law that are part of, say, being made righteous or following righteousness or escaping wickedness and sin. And noticing those differences and noticing those when he talks about the law is very, very important. Because, you know, for the Jewish people, God is uniquely working through the Jewish people to bring his will, his creative order, ultimately to bring the world into the dwelling place, to make it a dwelling place for him. And then the question is, who is the people who he's working through? Well, Paul's going to say stuff like he does it through Judaism, up through Jesus, and then the person of Jesus, it's possible to then expand it by faith. And then basically at that point, the boundary marker is simply faith that Jesus was who he said he was, right? Because if you didn't believe that, you wouldn't you wouldn't be within the definition of the worldview in which follows that, right? And so then, of course, the question is, who was Jesus? And what did he actually do? And what do you have to believe in? And those are the sort of questions. But let me give it to Ken.
Yeah, I guess what I would, for me, I look from the outside in here in a way. So if I can turn us around and look backwards, I'd like to bring in something that Jacob said earlier, which I thought was really insightful and really important to note, that I think I'm hearing from all of us, is that we're attempting to exist in a liminal space where we play on the fringes of the boundaries between, say, this membrane of what it can be. Yeah, I'm a Christian and I only go to church. My only friends are at church. And evolution is from the devil and like that whole kind of thing, right? And that's not where we are, right? We're on the fringes where we're saying, no, there's a lot going on outside of what you perceive as this membrane that's really important that you all are missing over here. And if this story is really real, it needs to connect to all of this out here. And so we're attempting to maybe in some sense be a channel through which the truth can become realized by all of those who are very confused about that truth can actually be contained within propositions, might be one way of saying it. And in that way, it made me think of, I don't know if you're watching After Socrates from John Vervaeke, but
Not yet.
Okay, in the second episode, it's called Socrates the Monstrous, and that notion is getting at that Socrates is monstrous in that he breaks categories, right? He plays within the categories, but he shifts between them and he pulls you outside of what you think is real. And in that way, this is what the sages do. To be a sage is to attempt to call people beyond who they were and attempt to afford bridges between layers that seem unbridgeable. And so that to me, so I want to play more from that space and look back at Christianity, because while all of those, like that was wonderful explanation for a lot of different aspects of Christianity and these theological this theological machinery that plays in this realm. There's this way in which, like, to be outside of God's story is to not be real, right? And so there's this way in which, even if I'm a Gentile in 4000 BC, I'm playing in God's story. I don't have to be a Jew to play in God's story. I don't have to be a Christian to play in God's story now. In some sense, I would say the distinction for me is God's story / the goodness of being. Is it being actualized in spite of my efforts of my will? Or is my will in accordance with it, such that it becomes more beautiful? And that, for me, is more the space of what we're talking about when we're talking about really participating with Christ. Now, all of these distinctions and these boundary lines downstream of that, I think, like you're talking about, Daniel, are like as you said, like if you don't have boundaries, there's, it's not clear, and that's fine. But for me, a lot of these some of the questions of justification by faith, it's like, well, if you understand what faith means, that whole kind of question goes away a little bit, because because faith is not an act of the will in some deep way. Now, there is an act of the will that shifts maybe how I participate with faith. I can participate more with faith or less with faith, but if I have no faith, I'm dead. Because faith has to be deep enough. Like, it has to go beyond the rational mind. It has to go beyond my like it goes beyond this ascent to a narrative. It like faith is deeper than that, I think. So all that to say, I'm not necessarily trying to, I am trying to muddy the waters a bit, I suppose, but I'm trying to do it in a way that says something that is always, how do I say this? What I'm always very cautious of and always attempting to pull at is any way of speaking about the Christian God that at all leaves anything out, right? If there's anything outside of the Christian God, then he's not God. Now, the way in which it's in God is a different question. But, yeah, so I'll stop there.
It's just yeah. Well, for what it's worth, Joseph, I still feel quite agnostic on a lot of those propositional questions about what actually went down and in what sense it's real and true, and how it occurred or was organized at the time, before the time, or after the time. But the realness of it, as Ken is saying, for me, speaks for itself and is non-rational or trans-rational. And that's why this experience is astonishing, is that I'm not propositionally working my way into it. What people are talking about, experiential Christianity, I'm accessing it through experience, and that has a realness that's realer than real.
Yeah, it's very Kierkegaardian, right? It has to be existential.
I need to read more Kierkegaard too. I'm deeply aware that if I was born in India, would this God person that's coming to me in visions be Krishna or another God person incarnate that has emerged in a completely different grammar and language? Why is it that I'm having the Jesus person? It's a part of the entire thing of which I am the latest emergent expression of. And it's real, but I don't know in what sense it's real. I know it's the sense that I'm experiencing is it's realer than real, but somehow I can hold that with the agnosticism, because it's not requiring me to reach out from that into the propositional claim yet. And I really feel the spirit of what John's putting forward in this new series, and that you're speaking to a little bit there, Ken, is something about that wedding of Jesus and Socrates, and something like was Jesus Christ a Christian, or was he also existing in that deeply liminal place as well?
Outstanding. I like getting to the meat of everything. So this is really quite lovely. So there's a few things. So there's a number of questions. So one has this question when it's like, why be a Christian? right? There would be like, why be a Christian versus, say, a Buddhist or an atheist or something else, right? So there's a question of a unique reason to do it. Or when I say reason, the word reason is always funny because it can be like meaning or also rationality. And I think one of the things that confuses us in the West is we use the word reason to do both at the same time, and everything gets to be kind of mess. But there's kind of like a reason to be Christian as opposed to, say, a reason to be something else, right? And where you are willing to say this narrative versus another narrative. So right there in the question is some kind of exclusivity, right? The problem, though, of course, is how do you have an exclusivity that also doesn't leave something out? Well, that seems like a contradiction. That doesn't even seem possible to do, right? And yet it follows that all truth is God's truth, right? That's a phrase you'll hear. If it is true, it is therefore somehow participating in or sign of God, whether it be in Christianity or not, right? And in fact, you can see the entire history of like sort of developing Christian thought or Christian theology, and arguably every theology, as an attempt to bring their particular theology to bear on something that was not expected before. And one of the most famous sources of having to do that is science. And that's why, religion has such a long experience of saying, oh, how do we incorporate this one? Oh, what do we do with this? Because there's a business of maintaining the internal consistency of the belief, not because you believe it's reducible to the internal consistency of the belief, but if it's possible that something that would arise that would necessarily show that the primary foundational beliefs of the religion are not true. Well, if that's the case, well, then it's not true, right? And ergo, and you go from there. So there's always this kind of tension. Now, the big tension that kind of emerges, say, between maybe Aquinas or I suppose Karl Barth, but that's debated different things, is the role of reason versus revelation. There's stuff like the analogy of being and the ability to reason, of which, is kind of always in a tension with revelation because you can reason out of revelation. But then there's also the problem that the Bible doesn't tell you directly what to do about Facebook. Nowhere does it say directly what you do about Facebook. So you have to reason how the Christian would use Facebook, but that automatically creates a tension because how do you do that and not leave revelation behind, right? How do you do that? Similarly, to say not leave revelation behind would be how do you be a Christian and reason about the reality of other religions, other views, and not leave the foundational definitions of what Christianity is behind? Which then, of course, begs the question, what are the foundational beliefs and definitions of Christianity? All right, good times. I'll also note it's very, very important. There's also a giant tension in Christianity between what's called cathatic and apathatic. Cathatic being the ability to have a theology of positive knowledge of God, or if you grant me that term, apathatic saying negative. Master Eckhart, I would say, different people of this nature. It is absolutely the case that any reasoning of God must ultimately end at a kind of apathatic position. The moment you say, we made this conclusion X about God, therefore God is X, you are now in a very problematic space, right? But if you say, we reason to a place where we concluded X, therefore there is reason that X might have something to do with God, but even if it does, it's infinitely off. This kind of move that you have to do, that's very, very tricky to navigate and to walk through that. Because example, if you're like a real hard apathetic thinker, then you actually will struggle to say that God has anything to do beauty, good, and truth. Like how can you say that God has anything to do with goodness, truth, and beauty? And indeed, very hard apathetic thinkers will say it's better to say that God's not good than to say that God is good, because what you mean by good is so infinitely off by what God actually is in his goodness that it would be more accurate to say that he's not good. The problem with that, though, is that sometimes when human beings say good, they mean taking care of their children. Are you meaning to say that taking care of your children literally has absolutely nothing to do with the goodness of God? And this is where you can get some sort of trouble, right? Sure, this is in all the giant debates between the analogy of being sign versus cause, like that's a big distinction, and all these other fun metaphysical things, right? And indeed, there can be a problem if you say that what humans can reason has absolutely nothing to do with God, because at that point, you're just talking about almost like a Derridian or maybe a Baudrillard event. God is just like an event that we have that may one day break into the space-time continuum and change everything. Well, okay, we can hold out for an event in a kind of philosophical sense, but you're not really at that point talking about, dare I say, a religion or theology, and it can be problematic. Again, every religion or theology, and I would even say philosophy, that doesn't have a robust apophatic category is in massive trouble because it, one, can't have mystery. And mystery is not something you cannot know, but something the more that you know of, there's more left to know. And that compels you and drives you forth and creates motivation. So the category of mystery is a very big thing. So whatever the foundational principles are of Christianity, they have to leave open a whole lot of mystery, a whole lot of possibility, and a whole lot of, even though they're definitional and exclusive, non-exclusivity. That's some tricky stuff, man. And this is where like you get into, because I'll pass it to someone who speaks before I talk for 20 minutes, but because this is all really great, is that you have this question of like the resurrection, okay? And you can go back to the early church. What's very interesting is like when you look in the gospel, they think that Jesus is the Messiah. The Messiah has a very specific role in Judaism. He's gonna kick out the Romans. He's gonna rebuild the temple, and he's going to start the process of bringing about the dwelling place of God. A very, very, very specific role. This is why when Jesus tells Peter he's gonna go die, Peter's like, "No, you're not." He's not just responding from everyone interprets that as a lack of faith. It's actually totally logical. He's like, "No, that's not what the Messiah does. So that's not what you're going to do." It's just a very illogical reaction, right? All right, well, Jesus dies. Jesus definitely dies. We can all agree that Jesus dies. The question, unless you don't believe in the historical Jesus at all, I do. We can have the discussion on why. But they believe Jesus dies. For some crazy reason, after Jesus fails to do everything the Messiah is supposed to do, a bunch of Christians, a bunch of Jews, not Christians, Jewish people still say he was the Messiah and actually almost up it a notch and start saying, "No, dude, it turns out like the Messiah is somehow the Son of God." And then they're willing to die for that. That's the other key component. They'll go to the point where they're martyred to it, or they're rejected by all the other Jews, all the people in the community. They pay a high price for it. So the question becomes, why? Now, like a Bart Ehrman or someone like that would say, well, because they were in denial and our brain does a lot of crazy stuff when we don't want to accept the truth and we pour all our eggs in the basket or something like that, right? Totally fair. You can say the same thing. There are a lot of people who believe that they encountered Jesus. Well, you said, well, yes, they had visions and dreams because of mourning. You can say all of that, but there's that reality of why that occurred. And then the kind of the foundational experience, you could say, somehow is located in that. That is where the early church started to say, we don't have to follow the same boundary positions. We don't have the same beliefs, and they changed in their character. And the question is why? You can say, well, because maybe they had a vision of resurrection that wasn't historically located. You could say that. You could say because they literally encountered the risen Lord in a physical component. That's why they did it. But some sort of explanation, kind of, I think, in the question of the foundation of Jesus, and then we can explore this or not, because there's been a lot of things said, becomes the question of what that was and what does that look like. And basically, when you follow so many of the creeds or something because creeds like the Apostle Creeds, the Iota Creed, all these different things are like they view those as the bare minimum of what you have to believe to be a Christian. They're like, all right, we're going to fight over this and we're going to distill what the bare freaking minimum is to be a Christian. And all of them have something about resurrection. All of them have something about that. And then the question, of course, is that, and then going from there into that discussion. So those would be some remarks I have to some of the things I would put forth.
Can I pick up on the resurrection thing really quick? This is an interesting thing to me because especially kind of in the Christian Vervaeke Venn overlap, this seems to be the thing, right? And in the couple of conversations that I had with John on his channel, we really coalesced around the question of Christ's cry on the cross, and which is about God and man kind of issue, and it all gets very difficult to put into words for exactly the kind of reasons that you were just saying, Daniel, right? Like the apophatic cataphatic issue. But the thing for me that I always have, the thing that I do, and I'm reasoning well, I think, is to pay attention to the place where the resistance comes from, right? And when I run into the resistance to the problem of was Jesus actually God, and or did he rise again? Because they're very tied up together. Those are almost the same question in some sense. The resistance always kind of comes from this, at least for me, this side of myself that takes, it's the very kind of post-Enlightenment modernity needing the proof, and the fact that we don't know a process by which people, just resurrect after 3 days, and those kinds of things, and we don't know how an immaculate conception would work, that kind of notion. And it's like, well, sure, but we're all here in the first place. So we already, just the notion of being in multiplicity already necessitates some kind of, oneness into multiplicity move, right? And there's also some way in which, despite all the ways in which we're not what we could be, we're all still real. And the only way, you basically can build all of the philosophy on those kinds of questions, right? But the only way that I can tell that has been come up with in a narrative way to make sense of all of that, and actually that feels satisfying to me, is this possibility that the one became one of the many, and became one of the many in such a way as to actually absorb the many in their most in the most vile and decrepit and evil place that they were able to produce, and that agape was able to reach that and then go all the way back to oneness. And the only way it makes sense for me that happened was that Jesus maybe actually was God, and he actually rose again. And for me to believe any of, to start doing philosophy in the first place has to kind of call into question the kind of modern scientism. And so I don't necessarily feel a need to say, yes, absolutely, I know for sure that Jesus was God and resurrected after he died. I just need to be able to say he might have. Because once I can say he might have, it's, how would I know that? To look back historically, the amount of distortion around, to try to look back historically and actually make a historical argument for it and all that stuff, man, it's a disaster. Why even go to the trouble? What's the point? That's for me, I guess. I'm just outlining what my journey with that question has been.
Okay, this is super helpful, and I want to try and what you just said is very clarifying, and I want to try to put it into words. First of all, where is it within me? What part of me is resistant to the idea of the resurrection? I think it's exactly that sort of scientifically oriented. I guess the part of me that still aligns with modernity, as much as I hate to admit that.
We all have it.
Yeah. But okay, so what clarified for me was, if the one, okay, so the whole idea of theosis is super important in terms of my, in terms of being able to actually come back to Christianity. This notion of theosis, this salvation, is actually a process of climbing ontological levels towards unification with God. Okay, it's not just this sort of binary propositional belief, it's that's super important. But in that, what I'm trying to get at is the idea that the one becomes one of the many. There's this idea that I forget which saint phrased it this way, but God became man so that man could become God. The one becoming one of the many so that the many can become one. Okay. To me, it's if when I move towards God, oneness with God, I am becoming that's what it is to be Christ okay. And to the degree that I am Christ it's that would mean that it's actually possible for me to raise from the dead or something like that. That's what I'm trying, that symmetry, I'm trying to get that. But like,
Yeah, yeah.
that's where I feel like that I don't see that anywhere in Christianity, except for like the resurrection in the age to come, which doesn't make sense to me, because it's like I died and the pattern is not there anymore. I don't understand that. And I'm like working through this in real time. But that symmetry, it's like that has to be possible. And I don't know that to be possible. The whole idea, I have to see, I have to have an ontology or something in which that's possible, and I don't have that. And so right now, the miracle, the whole idea of a miracle, and in particular the miracle of the resurrection, it feels like this, it feels very arbitrary, like reality breaks and loses its intelligibility. And if reality loses its intelligibility fundamentally, then like there's a big problem with that.
Yeah. So I want to make two comments really quickly, and then the first comment is your mention of symmetry. I think this is so important because it's like, to the degree that I'm able to understand that Christ could be a man and God is symmetrical to my ability to understand that I can be a man and God.
Yes.
Right. That is, those things go together hand in hand for me. And then to the other point of the resurrection of this body, let's say, it's like, man, the sequence of temporal events will get you like it. You have to kind of take off the glasses of temporality, right? You've got like, because all that stuff is in the eternal framework, right? Because in the ontological framework, all time is one, right? Time is like the time is the actualizing of the many, but in an ontological sense. And I think this is why Vervaeke's stuff about narrative not being primary, I find that deeply helpful, because I've been making the argument recently that Christianity is actually the religion that finishes the narrative and thus allows you to become non-narrative, so to move in and out of the narrative of reality, I think is what is kind of the magic of the Christian story. But I totally agree with you. Like, it doesn't seem possible as long as you're wearing temporal glasses.
I love what you just said about the relationship between time and ontology. Yeah, I just wanted to thread myself into this because it feels like it's touching on also kind of core tension point or meeting point of the understanding up to this point. Prior to these recent experiences of feeling like Jesus is coming in, I was much more of the orientation that Christ was a man who, through particular circumstances, manifested the possibility of Christ consciousness, leaving behind the Holy Spirit, that, we may all have the possibility of experiencing that. And it's only through my first person ontologically shifting experiences of going from Jacob in his small world and particular context to 5 grams of mushrooms later, Jacob, well, not really Jacob at all at that point, but something that feels like what Joseph's talking about, of a sort of theosis property. And that is what feels like the most blasphemous and core element to my entry point into this, which is that for me became the reference point of what does Christ consciousness feel like? What does it feel like to be that larger thing that is coming into the particularity of here, but I'm not confined to here. I'm something from that larger thing that happens to be in this instance, in this time, in this moment. And that's a trippy space to be in. And during that same trip that my, ex is talking about the notion that what happened to Jesus on the cross really happened. And in some real sense, it happened now. And that's also people talk about this cross point, that it's somehow at the crossing, it's the intersecting point somehow beyond space and time, and therein lies the power of it. So that kind of disposed me to be like, well, in relationship to God, in relationship to this tradition, but not this particular Jesus thing, this particularization. Jesus is Lord. Jesus is this absolutely particular eventing person that somehow also exists beyond space and time. And now I'm all muddled up and I don't really know where to stand on the whole thing.
Okay, but can I just like push back a little bit on that? Because like
yeah, please.
If I understand what you're saying, and I'm not sure I understand the ontology and temporality and how the relationship of those, but if I understand what you're saying, Jacob, it's like the resurrection is a fractal event that's occurring everywhere all the time to varying different degrees at different scales and all of that. It's not that it happened at one particular point in history and that's what the resurrection means. It is that sort of.
I'm not saying the resurrection, I'm saying the crucifixion and what spiritually transpires in the course of the crucifixion that alters the nature of what's possible in reality, that both happened and is happening.
Okay, but I think what I'm trying to get at is like the particular event is like for the Christian very important, and also it's part of the pattern. Like the particularity is part of the pattern. The part of the pattern that's occurring all the time. It's the particular, and part of the larger pattern is the particularity, the particular point in history. Like if you look at the bigger arc of history, like that, and I understand that all in terms of, if I look at the Christian story, that pattern, the way like Pajot lays it out, the particularity of the incarnation, that it happened at a particular point in time and space, that is part of the pattern, and I get that. But it's when I step into history that suddenly that breaks and I can't see it anymore. It's like when I take a historical lens, when I put on the historical lens, I can't make that work. And that's like that's where like I don't know. I'm wondering, Ken, if you might be able to kind of articulate what you mean by like what I'm almost looking like phenomenologically, what does that mean, if that's the right question? I'm not sure that's the right question, but like articulating what does it mean for the temporal to be like getting out of the temporality of this.
And just briefly before you do that, regarding the temporality of the dialogue, we are well past 90 minutes. So I just want to, check in with everybody's energies. Happy to continue to a natural close. Maybe we can sort of draw to a close at the hour or something. It's keep it rolling. All right, let's just draw it to whenever it feels right. But I know we can't unpack it all today.
Yeah, I'll probably need to go in about 15 minutes, but feel free to keep going. I mean, you guys, it's always a challenge to have more than two people in a conversation because there's always something to pick up everywhere, right? So if I understand correctly, you've also had psilocybin experiences, Joe. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll try to rely on that framing a little bit with my phenomenology. Have you, Daniel? If you're not comfortable sharing, that's fine. Okay. So there's always this problem of the temporal and the eternal. And I kind of visualize it like a sphere, and that the sphere itself is real. And the outside of the sphere, like on the outside of the sphere, is what you might say is like eternity, an eternal being. And on the inside of the sphere, there's like, imagine a lot of very small spaces created, and that's like my particular life, right? And it's a particular space, right? There's a particular container that I'm given that are the hard constraints of my life, where I'm born, all those kinds of things, right? And then based on the choices that I make in my life, I either fill that up with beauty or I fill it up with darkness, which has all kinds of ramifications outward from me, because all of it is interconnected in this sphere, right? But that is experienced in a linear time frame, right? But the sphere itself is still real, and it contains me. It undergirds me. It is the being that gives me being. And so it means something different, and it looks different if I'm trying to look at the particular, because that's a sphere, right? So when I'm in the temporal time frame, that's the sphere that I'm in, and it's playing out over a linear move, and I'll leave that aspect up. But then I can step out of that and start to look at the whole, and that's where this ontological kind of questions start to lay themselves out a little bit more. And so if I switch my metaphor of the sphere slightly now, switch it to like layers of ontology, right? So there's like the outside layer is just being as such, and that's where it just disappears, right? The ground of being and non-being, where we use the word God, and it's where it disappears into like we don't know, right? But then every layer below that, things, you might say there's the layer of truth, there's the layer of goodness, well, if you're going to use Plato, like there's the good, and then there's truth, there's beauty, there's the loves are how you interact with those, there's all these different virtues that you can participate with. But as you go down these layers, there's a layer at which there is the actual narrative being of individuals, and downstream of that is distortion, right? At whatever layer sin can happen, downstream of that, there's distortion from the perspective of the being as such. And so in order to redeem the whole thing, there had to be a point at which that was actually crossed. And that is why I think that particular is so necessary of Jesus actually as a historical event happening to cross that layer and then go to hell and come back out in this idea, and therefore let everything become realized, and it's all actually real then. But as soon as I take on my particular space, in order to take on that particular space, it's very difficult to do that without assuming time to be fundamental. But time is not fundamental. Like, time cannot be fundamental. It is to our existence as particulars, yes, but it's not to being as such. And so that's the place for me anyway. I don't know if I'm making sense here, but I hope I am. But it's this assumption that time as we understand it is fundamental. Is if I'm hearing you correctly, maybe the place where things are getting sticky.
I'd have to sit with that for a while before I can. Yeah, I'd have to sit with that for a while. So if anyone else wants to jump in.
Just briefly to say that what you're saying feels like it rings true with the resonance of that particular experience that I've had, and what it feels like to be in that space, which in some sense is timeless, and yet there's a possibility of indwelling timelessness and then still being in your body, in the particularities of that dual awareness of like, I can be that timeless, immensely spaciousness state of being, and at the same time hold the awareness, I'm in my body, I'm in a room, I'm in an apartment in Berlin, I can hear birds outside the window, the world is still happening, I'm still bound to it, but there is.
But in order to get there, you have to drop your identities, and you have to drop your, right? You can project reality. That's what we do when we set goals for the future. We're projecting a reality into the future, and we're holding ourselves to that. And thereby we're narrowing our frame space, right? And you're also doing that when you're bringing along the old versions of yourself, which is something like unrepentance. It's also unforgiveness. This, this is why you're forgiven to the degree that you forgive. So to live in Christ consciousness and the theosis space, I think, is something like to be fully present in such a way that you're not projecting anything into the future, and you're not pulling anything forward from the past. And thus your particularity becomes a through line of awareness as such. But it can only happen when there's none of you left. Like there's almost, every identity is just kind of contextual, right? It's like, am I a Christian? Well, in a sense, right? Am I a Buddhist? Sure, in a sense, but only but very loosely, and only not in a way that, I don't know if I can say that correctly, so I'm not going to say that. Let this cut off that.
Ken, I just want to say, this feels like the essence of what you were getting at with Paul, which was this dialectic between, is the kingdom of heaven here and now? Is it a non-narrative experience of presence, or is it this towardness that Paul is talking about? And it seems to me there's a dialectic between the two, and we can somehow the towardness becomes more beautified the more that we can dissolve it into that presenceness and then have it come back through. So
yeah, consider the lilies.
Well, that was beautiful, Ken. I appreciate it very much. And alas, I know you have to run in 5 minutes, so we will not keep you for another 3 hours. And as much fun as that would be, but this has been quite a joy. A few things. I think it's completely correct to view sin as separation from God and therefore a lack of being. And so therefore, if God saves the world, he somehow fills wherever there's a lack of being. What's very important is by God. So when we say like a fundamental belief of Christianity is believing, or I was saying Jesus is God, what that would also entail is that God somehow engages in a level of emptying, or a level of like darkening, to where he can genuinely and fully experience what it's like to thirst, to be hungry, to be rejected, to die. The reason why this is quite important is because if sin equals separation from God, then sin is its own punishment. That's very important. And also, Jesus is thereby where God went. It became possible for God. God went into every possible place where there could be separation from him, the greatest of which would be death. That means there is no part of the universe where you must necessarily be hopeless. If there was any part of the universe where God had not entered participatory, this is very important, because people say, well, couldn't God just resurrect you from the dead? Yeah, but he's separate from that. It's an abstraction to God, actually. By going into participation, there is therefore no place in all of the universe in which separation from God must necessarily be the case, because God has participatorily gone into all of those places. And therefore, separation from God is no longer. So the entire horizon of therefore the universe changes in all space of time, because there is no necessary place of necessary separation from God. If I see a green cat once in my life and never again, then the entire universe is a place where green cats are possible. I only have to see it once, and then forever it is so possible. If there is some point in history where God enters in his in particularity, and he undergoes those separations ontologically now. He doesn't literally have to have every single possible participatory experience, which would not be possible as a finite man in humanity. He has to enter into an ontological realm and participate in the essence, which would include the accidents, to use like Aristotelian language. And death would also be its own ontology. But some people could push back and say in the Holy Spirit, he actually does participatory, like the Holy Spirit is another person of the Trinity. And in every one of whom the Holy Spirit dwells, and he therefore has those experiences as well. That's fine. Either model would work. But what you get is a fullness of God's participation in literally everything that human beings has gone through, from the depths of suffering, which in one also means that God takes responsibility for his creation, that he created a thing where there would be suffering and et cetera, so forth. But it also means that there is no place of necessary hopelessness, no place of necessary inability for grace to reach. And so that entirely changes what the universe is forever and so forth. Now, the next thing that I think is, so I agree with everything that Ken was saying on time. And in a sense, you could say the fall is history itself, as in going into history where you have sequence, as opposed to maybe what something like, now I'm going to throw out Bergson's duration, but eternity, Bergson's duration seems to be closer. Don't ask me about any of that. But where sequence itself and being stuck in finite points seems to be kind of a very feature of separation from God, which makes sense because God is in eternity and he is not bound by space and time. That doesn't mean there isn't a kind of sequence or a kind of passage in God, but it is one that is not in terms of space-time as we know it. What it is in terms is I think intimacy and love, and the nature of how space and time is experienced in love. Because if you believe God is the Trinity, then you believe God that it is his deepest essence, that the deepest essence of reality is love in a very profound way. And love has a multitude that becomes one yet. It's not God is not a unity like a giant blob, like in the Thane movie or something like that. God is a unity that's more like, I think, the divine and extraordinary end of the second book of the Space Trilogy by C.S. Lewis, where he talks about a description of the Trinity as a dance, and where that would mean deepest reality is a dance. And what is a dance? A dance is kind of funny because there are people who are not the same person, and yet in the action, they are the same person. And they're only not the same technically, but practically they are. And the revelation of God is that practical is more real than technical. And so what we see is that in God, deepest reality is a kind of intimacy. And in participating in that intimacy then has an experience of time and an experience of passage. That is what it is like in eternity. And imagine those experiences where you're totally lost in the lover. How does time pass? How does sequence occur? I bet you it's very different than work. I bet you it's very different than drudgery. It is an entirely different ontological experience that brings with it a temporal reality as well, because those things go together. So the claim of Christianity that I think we can put at a fundamental level, and then you can get into other issues, say Immaculate Conception, baptism, actual resurrection, et cetera, has something to do with the notion that God came into the universe, emptying himself to have full participatory experience of all of the universe. So there is no point where there must be a necessary separation of God. And therefore there is no point in the universe where there can't be the possibility of full being in the person of Christ. And in believing in him, you simultaneously believe that this individual unveils that God is a kind of Trinity, which I think is important. And in that Trinity, that means the essence of reality is not merely a story, but it is an experience of love and intimacy in of itself, which also unveils that the deepest form of unity is a harmony of many as one, not a blurring of difference into a singularity, which then the story, what's deeper than the story is the dance per se. But the story is the precondition that makes possible the dance, because the story in which God comes into the universe fills in all separation from God. And that means you can be part of the dance as well. That means you are not necessarily separated from the dance, and you can live a life and have an eternity of an experience of that very dance. And the universe is an opportunity to enter into that dance.
That was so fucking beautiful.
Sure we don't have another 3 hours?
I think we do, because of eternity, there's no bound by space or time or different. I'd love to do it. This has been I've really enjoyed it, Jake. I'm so glad you organized it.
Yeah, Daniel, thank you so much. That was, I could cry. That was so beautiful. I really feel like you've threaded the yarn of this whole thing into something beautiful, and that it feels like a great kind of closing expression. So this has been an absolute gift, and really glad to do it. And yeah, not much more to say than that. So thank you all. Any closing remarks you guys want to make, you're welcome.
It's been a blast. Thank you all. Goodness, I've loved it.
Yeah, this has been great. I feel like we're just getting started. And the last point about the dance being deeper than the story is like, it touches on this whole conversation about narrative, and also it touches on experiences that I've had that are very profound to me. And so I hope that the conversation can continue soon.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, it was lovely. I enjoyed it. Thanks for inviting me.
It was a pleasure to meet you all. Real delight.
All right. Thank you all, gentlemen. I hope we can reconvene sometime, and yeah, hope the joy of this dialogue can spread outwardly. All right, I'm going to stop the recording here. Thank you.